So hopefully you've had time to watch your individual video on COVID and its implications for your particular type, and the type review and the motivations behind each type, and then just some practical questions about testing your pulse and your health. That was the series of videos we've done before. So now what I'd like to do is just do one video for all types, 2, 6, 7, and 9. And just talk about what's a simple practice you might be able to engage in now that you may have done some work in self-assessment and awareness. So if you take a step back from the whole process for a second, and not to make it too rigid and equational, but to look at it in a logical sense or a perspective. If you have awareness, which is hopefully what we did in the first set of videos for each type, then the next stage would be deconstruction. So that's a fancy way of saying taking that awareness and diving into it and looking at both the strengths and faults within each type and how it navigates the world, and see what we might be able to do with that space and sit in it for a while and not just rush to next steps on how to build yourself back up, which would be the third stage. So awareness, deconstruction, and then reconstruction practices. So not to make it too fancy, basically the next step in the stage of health would be to say, I need to sit in my type and see what's happening within it. And so to that effect, there are a series of practices that we can engage in to help sit in our type selves. Because again, remember, while you have a number, that's not fully descriptive of who you are. So while I might be a 5 on the Enneagram, Jeff is not just a 5, right? There's a lot more to me than just my Enneagram number, and not just from a psychological standpoint, but from the standpoint of just how I am in the world. And vice versa for you, you are not just a 2, a 6, a 7, or a 9. There's a lot about you that is unique to you. And so it is a mistake to think that you are defined in toto by your type, because you are not. Your type is a helpful description or sketch about what's going on inside your head and in your heart. So just keep that in mind, because you don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that your type exhausts you. Health, given all that, is moving beyond your type. So it's saying hey, this describes my inner world really well. 5 really describes me, Jeff, really well. But in order to be healthy, I need to get out of that. I need to challenge certain things. So that's what we're doing when we talk about deconstruction. So all that's free. But basically the practices that you can engage in to make it practical is silence, solitude, and seclusion. We'll get into in a little bit. So solitude, obviously, we've probably already experienced that a bit with COVID, but that is withdrawal from social engagement. It's being by yourself. Literally by yourself. No other person in the room. The TV is not on. You are by yourself. And for some types, that's easy. For other types, that's extremely difficult. For all types, that's difficult in the sense of distraction comes in all the time, but that is one practice that we'll talk about here in a second. The second is silence, which is basically just removing distractions. You're not only by yourself, but you are quiet, which is hard to come by in our culture, at least. There's always digital devices looking for our attention, family members looking for our attention, our own thoughts, our own emotions, the emotional worlds we have look for our attention. And really we're trying to quiet those as well, let them bubble up to the surface, but let those be quiet as well, so we can sit with God, with the presence and the face and the attention of God on us. And then the last one would be stillness, which is basically just restraint. When you feel that desire to act, this is a waste of time, or what am I supposed to be doing? Showing restraint and pushing that down and just being in the presence of God. So those would be the 3 little practice steps of solitude, silence, and restraint or stillness. Now each type has a specific emphasis, I guess you could say, on what would be best for them in that process. And I'm trying to find it. Here it is. And so Enneagram 9s, let's start with you. You're at the top. So it's pretty easy for 8s, 9s, and 1s, all those numbers in the gut triad, to define themselves by what they do. It's the lie that you can somehow exercise control on your environment, whether you're like an 8 and you demand it and you make it happen, or you're a 9 and you control your inner world through peace and avoidance of conflict, or if you're a 1 and demand justice. You somehow believe the idea that I am what I do. And so the specific practice for 9s, you guys, is stillness and restraint, to be able to push down whatever is bubbling up to the surface in action steps, or avoidance steps for 9s, because 9s are a little, not in a bad way. But that's a good practice for you, is stillness. And so when we say stillness, we're talking about simply being. Now, with a 9, as opposed to an 8 or a 1, you must be careful as a 9, because sometimes that looks like inactivity. 9s can, don't you tell me what to do, and need momentum to build towards action. So a healthy 9 will have some action in their life. But stillness does not necessarily mean just being by yourself and not doing anything. That's, I'm trying to be kind with my words, that's lazy. And you don't want to be that. What you want to be is still, and there's a distinction. The distinction is simply perhaps an intention and your attention. Intention and attention. So your intention, when you're still, is to repress any desire to be defined by what you do, or what you don't do, or your peaceful stance, or whatever that might be. And your attention should focus on God and His face and His gaze upon you. So when you're talking about deconstruction for 9s, that's a very good process to engage in, because it kind of whittles away all that chaff that needs to be burned off of you, in a way, to use a smithing metaphor. And so that's the practice for 9s. Now when it comes to 2s, you have a different kind of false belief, and that is, I am what other people see me as or think of me as. Now, when you think about silent solitude and stillness, the perhaps counterintuitive practice for deconstructing what's going on inside of you is solitude. Now, that probably is like, oh, I don't necessarily like that. And maybe you can tolerate that a little bit better. But for some 2s, the idea of being by yourself when your entire motivational structure is to bless and help other people. If you remove other people, that's painful. And we talked about that when we were talking about the implications of COVID. Now, like what solitude does for you guys as 2s is it challenges that false belief that you are what other people say or think or view you as. It's a spiritual practice of deconstruction. So it's saying, I'm going to intentionally be by myself for a set amount of time so that I can pay attention to my type, and that's painful. Just to take a step back from the types and the specific practices, this stuff is painful. So if it doesn't feel painful, and we're not talking about like I'm dying inside, it's just to say that it hurts, it's going against the grain of you a bit, then we're doing it wrong. But anyway, going back to 2s, so solitude, it's the intention of challenging that false belief that, hey, if I can't help my husband or my wife or my kids or my friends, then I don't know what to do. It's challenging that and saying you need to be alone with yourself. You need to be alone with yourself and look into yourself. And the intention, again, is on God, because you're not really alone, are you, 2s? You are hopefully sitting under the gaze of God looking into you, and you're sitting in that relationship where, again, interestingly enough, you're not necessarily offering anything to God. You're giving your love, hopefully, but God is self-sufficient, right? So there's that intimate co-dance that you have as lovers, in a sense, but God is giving you what you need, and as 2s, that's deeply, deeply impactful. For solitude, for 2s, that's huge. So now, moving on to 6s and 7s, you guys are a little different. I'll throw 5s in there as well, just so that I'm with you. We believe that we are what we have. And so security and safety is huge for 5, 6s, and 7s. We want to be safe. And we approach that in different ways, but for 6s and 7s, it's the idea that for 6s, like if I don't have allies or a plan, I am not safe. And for 7s, it's if I don't have freedom and future thought and flexibility, then I'm in trouble. And so the move for us is to go into silence, and to remove kind of the idea that all the noise and all the clatter and all the information and all our thoughts need to be quiet, which again is counterintuitive because we're typically in our heads. We like to think, we like to plan, and so the idea of being silent is counterintuitive to us. But again, the intention of that is to quiet your head and to turn it off, which is extremely painful and difficult to do for 5, 6s, and 7s, with the attention towards what God is saying to you. Now, I'm going to stop there. The idea here, though, is that what does that look like practically? And then I'll close. So the first step you have to have is the first step, which was awareness. And so maybe for you guys, you just need to spend time digging into your type a little bit more and see how COVID's impacting that. But if you're ready to move on into this stage of deconstructing yourself, then you're going to be looking at these practices, and what you're going to want to be paying attention to is temptations to go back into your typical patterns, to go back towards people, to go back towards activity, to go back towards thoughts in your head. And you want to begin to practice those practices, a silent solitude and quiet, to usurp those, to deconstruct those, and sit in it, the pain or whatever it is, and be able to pay attention to God. Because it's not the point is not just to hurt or to move against your typical patterns inside of you. The point is to sit with God and let Him do work in you. That's the point. It's to say, like, my pattern's to do this, but I want to let God move into that space with holy love and kindness and mercy and grace, because that's who He is, and to try to experience that. So that's kind of a brief nutshell, as best I can do in 14 minutes with 4 different types, without sitting with you. Like, if I could sit with you, then we could dive into this a lot more. I also have a lot of thoughts about other practices, shocker, but for now, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, after you're aware, to deconstruct yourself by sitting in silent solitude, with the gaze of God, and to see what bubbles up. Love you guys. See you later.